In this video, I will be discussing 9-8, subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. Subtracting fractions is very similar to adding fractions. The only difference is that once you find two fractions with common denominators, you just subtract the numerators instead of adding them. So let's look at an example. If I had 5/6 minus 1/2, we have the same steps as yesterday with adding fractions. So the first thing is to find a common denominator. It will help you when you need to simplify if you find the least common denominator. So let's go ahead and do that. The least common denominator of 6 and 2 is 6. So step 2 says to rename each fraction. 5/6 is already in 6, so I don't need to rename it. But 1/2 in terms of 6, we need to figure out what that is. 2 times 3 equals 6, so 1 times 3 equals 3. That's how you figure out the numerator. Step 3 says to subtract the numerators. 5 minus 3 is 2. And step 4 says to keep the denominator the same, 6ths. Now, this is a scenario where even though I found the LCD of 6 and 2, I can still simplify at the end. This happens sometimes, so you need to make sure that even when you finish a problem, you go back and make sure it's in simplest form. So I know that I can divide the top number by 2 and the bottom number divided by 2 to get 1/3, 1/3. However, we made it easier on ourselves by using the least common denominator. We only had to do one step to simplify. Had we used a bigger number, it would have been a bit trickier to simplify. So my answer here is 1/3. Let's look at another example. If I wanted to find the answer for 6/7 minus 1/2, here's what I would do. I'm going to find a common denominator for 7 and 2, and it's usually easiest, like I said, to use the least common denominator. The least common denominator for 7 and 2 is 14. The second step is to rename each of your fractions with your new common denominator. To get from 7 to 14, I multiplied by 2, so that means that I need to multiply my numerator 6 by 2, which is 12. To get from 2 to 14, I multiplied by 7. So I need to multiply my numerator 1 by 7, which is 7. Now I can go ahead and move on to steps 3 and 4. Step 3 says to subtract the numerators. 12 minus 7 is 5, and keep the denominator, 14. It does say to simplify if necessary, which means if you can, but 5/14 is already in simplest form. I know that because their only common factor is 1. So we're done. Let's look at a word problem. As a hint, most of the problems on your test that require you to subtract fractions will be in word problem form. This one says, Miss Emery had 9/10 cup of juice and she drank 2/3 of a cup. How many cups of juice does she have left? So I started with 9/10 and then I drank 2/3. So 2/3 is the amount that I'm subtracting. With fractions, since they look different and might not have the same denominator, sometimes it can be tricky to tell which one needs to go first and which goes second. So you really have to think through what the word problem is telling you. Now we need to find a common denominator. I know that both of these numbers go into 30, and that's their least common denominator. So now I'm going to rewrite each fraction with the denominator of 30. To go from 10 to 30, I do times 3. So 9, the numerator, times 3 is 27. To go from 3 to 30, I multiply by 10. So 2 times 10 is 20. So now my new problem is 27/30 minus 20/30. It looks different, but these numbers are equivalent to what I started with. So now I just subtract the top numbers. 27 minus 20 is 7. And keep the denominator, 30. Since 7 is a prime number, that means that the only things that go into 7 are 1 and 7. Since 7 doesn't go into 30, the only common factor these two numbers have is 1, which means that it's in simplest form. So I have 7/30 of a cup of juice left. Here's a problem for you to try on your own. If you're still confused at this point, I would recommend going back and rewatching the last few examples. If you're ready to move on to this practice problem, then go ahead. I want you to try the problem 7/8 minus 1/3. third. Show your work, make sure that you follow these 4 steps, and simplify if you need to, and bring it with you to class tomorrow. Good luck!